We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
You're listening to Carousel Sniper Victim, a Dead Glass Design production, with your host, Sean Jeffrey.
For we meet in an hour of change and challenge, in a decade of hope and fear, in an age of both knowledge and ignorance. The greater our knowledge increases, the greater our ignorance unfolds. Despite the striking fact that most of the scientists that the world has ever known are alive and working today, the vast stretches of the unknown and the unanswered and the unfinished still far outstrip our collective comprehension. There is no strife, no prejudice, no national conflict in outer space as yet. Its hazards are hostile to us all. Its conquest deserves the best of all mankind, and its opportunity for peaceful cooperation may never come again. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to...
The human thirst for excellence,
notre soif humaine,
knowledge,
pour l'excellence et la connaissance.
every step up the ladder of science, every adventurous reach into space, all of our combined modern technologies and imaginations, even the wars that we fought have provided us the tools.
We humans are an inquisitive bunch. We're drawn to see what lies beyond the next hill or across that unknown stretch of ocean. Exploration is built into our DNA. The reward we're given in exchange for our exploratory nature is discovery. We discover new lands and acquire new technologies in the process of exploring. The cost of this exploration and discovery is often many human lives, though. Whether it's natives who suffer under the hands of colonisation, thousands often die at the arrival of a foreign conqueror, or the millions that have died as empires have expanded. Think of how many lives have been lost at sea during the great ages of discovery in the recent centuries past. The newest frontier that humans are trying to explore is that of the cosmos. Astronauts. The word is coined from the ancient Greek astro for star and nautis for sailor, so literally star sailor. Astronauts and the aeronautics and space industries that support them are modern-day adventurers, testing scientific methods, new technologies and instruments, attempting to broaden our collective understanding of where we lie in the universe and expand our horizon further than that of just our own planet. The cosmos, in the grand scheme of things, though, is pretty indifferent to our struggles. We are, after all, just an advanced breed of talking monkey that's attempting to explode our way off our little rock. If we can just make this boomstick go bang the right way, we could fly to the sky, yeah? In reality, we're only just beginning to explore space. Just as in the years leading up to the 20th century, when we first launched our species beyond our own little spinning rock, the quest to discover new things still comes with a price. Just as back in the day, the ocean would take any sailor to a watery grave without so much indifference or any sense of malice, the vacuum of space will also willingly accept any explorer that ventures astray. In the early morning hours of the 30th of June 1971, the Soviet Union was preparing to welcome its 3 latest cosmonaut heroes back to Earth: Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev. They had just completed a record-breaking space mission. Not only had the Soyuz 11 team spent more than 23 days in orbit, but they had also successfully occupied the world's first true space station. It was a fitting response to the US achievement of placing a man on the moon, but not quite as good. The commander of one of the recovery helicopters spotted the parachute of Soyuz 11's descent module and was quoted saying that it was a glorious sight. The spacecraft itself was still superheated and charred from re-entry, although as far as everyone was aware, the re-entry had gone according to plan. Soyuz 11's touchdown was a completely automatic process, from the parachute deployment to the firing of its solid-fueled soft-landing rockets in the base of the descent module. These rockets slowed the descent module as it approached the surface upon re-entry. Everything was run completely by the onboard landing software. The 3 Russian cosmonauts only had to hold on and enjoy the return ride to Earth. It was 2:16 AM Moscow time when the vehicle came back to terra firma. The helicopters touched down and the recovery team made their way cheerfully to the spacecraft. They could not have anticipated the horror that they would find inside. At the main base of operations, Nikolai Kamenin, the commander of the cosmonaut team, and veteran cosmonaut Alexei Yeliseyev had been waiting more than an hour. They were waiting to hear back from the recovery team, waiting for news of the successful recovery mission. What they received, though, was a series of numbers. Just 3 numbers. But the worst 3 numbers they could have hoped to receive. 1, 1, 1. In the Russian space program, a system of 5 numbers, running down from 5 to 1, are used to explain a cosmonaut's health. These denoted that he was in excellent condition, 5, that he was in good condition, 4, that he had suffered injuries, 3, that the injuries were of a severe nature, 2, and that they were fatal, 1. There was 1 number for each member of the crew. The 111 meant all 3 cosmonauts were dead. Immediately, Yeliseyev, Kamenin, and another veteran cosmonaut, Vladimir Shatalov, were flown directly to the landing site in Kazakhstan to see for themselves what nobody could quite believe. One of the initial rescuers would later state, outwardly, there was no damage whatsoever. They knocked on the side of the descent module, but there was no response from within. On opening the hatch, they found all 3 men in their chairs, motionless, with dark blue patches on their faces and trails of blood from their nose and ears. They removed them from the descent module. Dobrovolsky was still warm. The doctors gave artificial respiration. Based on the reports, the cause of death was suffocation. It would be determined in the subsequent investigation that an air vent had been jerked open during the separation of the orbital and descent modules, and that all 3 men had been dead for over half an hour. For at least 11 minutes of this time, they had been exposed to the vacuum of space. Based on the data from the onboard memory device, the orbital and instrument modules separated at an altitude of around 128 kilometers or 80 miles above the surface of the Earth. The pressure in the descent module began to fall rapidly at that moment. At 1:47 AM and 26 seconds, Moscow time, 2 seconds prior to jettisoning the orbital module, the pressure in the descent module was 915 millimeters of mercury, which is normal. Within 115 seconds, the pressure had dropped to 50 millimeters and was still falling. In effect, there was no longer any air in the cabin. The position of the bodies in the descent module suggested that Dobrovolsky and Patsayev had tried to unstrap in order to close the valve, but hadn't been able to act quickly enough. At the instant of separation of the orbital and instrument modules, when they first became aware of the leak, their pulse rates shot up dramatically. Dobrovolsky's to 114 beats per minute, Volkov's to 180. 50 seconds after the separation of the two modules, Patsayev's pulse had dropped down to 42 beats per minute, indicative of someone suffering oxygen starvation, and by 110 seconds, all three men's hearts had stopped beating. It would be a blessing to suppose that their deaths, though mercifully rapid, were also painless, but high-altitude decompression and exposure to the vacuum of space does not produce painless results. The official autopsies from the Budenko Military Hospital remain classified to this day, as do several other documents relating to the disaster, but a number of conclusions have been made. Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev would first have experienced strong pains in their heads, chest, and abdomens, after which their eardrums would have burst, and blood would have begun streaming from their nose and mouths. Quote, "Due to outgassing of oxygen from the venous blood supply to the lungs," wrote Dr. Ivanovich, "the men would have remained conscious for 50 to 60 seconds. However, they would have moved about and tried to remedy their plight only during the first 13 seconds, this being the time of useful consciousness, corresponding to the time that it took for the oxygen-deprived blood to pass from the lungs to the brain. 13 seconds, that's all. From flipping a switch to separate the modules, to an insane amount of pain, blood coming out of the nose, eyes and mouth, and then slipping into unconsciousness. And then your descent module delivers your body safely back to the ground." This wasn't the first incident to claim the life of a Russian cosmonaut, however. To get to the tragic events of Soyuz 11, there obviously had to be a Soyuz 1. Soyuz 1 was the first crewed flight of the Soyuz spacecraft. Manned by cosmonaut Colonel Vladimir Komarov, the mission plan was complex, involving a planned rendezvous with another craft, Soyuz 2, and an exchange of crew members before returning to Earth. Prior to launch, Soyuz 1 engineers are said to have reported 203 design faults to the political party leaders, but their concerns were overruled by political pressures to mark the anniversary of Lenin's birthday. So even though the scientists are telling you it's not going to work, it has to be done by Lenin's birthday. Yuri Gagarin was the backup pilot for Soyuz 1 and was aware of the design problems and the pressures from the political parties to proceed with the flight. He attempted to, quote, bump Komarov from the mission, knowing that the Soviet leadership would not want to risk a national hero on the flight. 6 years earlier, in 1961, Yuri Gagarin had become the first human to enter into outer space and orbit the Earth in his Vostok spacecraft. Although Yuri knew the dangers and was doing all he could to try and save his cosmonaut comrade, at the same time, Komarov refused to pass on the mission, even though he believed it to be doomed. He explained he could not knowingly risk Yuri Gagarin's life. Soyuz 1 was launched on the 23rd of April 1967 at 32 minutes after midnight from the Baikonur Cosmodrome, carrying Komarov, the first Soviet cosmonaut to fly in space twice. The problems began shortly after launch, when one solar panel failed to unfold, leading to a shortage of power for the spacecraft systems. Further problems with the orientation detectors complicated maneuvering the craft. By orbit 13, the automatic stabilization system was completely dead, and the manual system was only partially effective. The crew of Soyuz 2 now modified their mission goals, preparing themselves for a launch that would include fixing the solar panel of Soyuz 1. However, that night, thunderstorms at Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan affected the booster's electrical system, causing the mission to be called off. it was decided that Soyuz 1 should also cancel its mission and begin to attempt re-entry. After even more errors and glitches, it wasn't until the 18th orbit of the Earth that they commenced the final re-entry procedure. An analyst from the United States National Security Agency, under the pseudonym of Winslow Peck, reported that he had been on duty at a listening post near Istanbul in Turkey on the night of Soyuz 1's re-entry. According to the NSA radio operator, both controllers and Komarov himself knew that his survival was unlikely, and the cosmonaut even spoke to his wife, Valentina, and to Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin. In the exchange, Komarov told his wife how to handle his affairs and what to do with their children. According to the report, by the end, Komarov was falling apart. It was awful. These and other harrowing, though unverified accounts suggest that the cosmonaut had some awareness that the problems he faced were insurmountable. Unconfirmed stories over the years hinted that, when re-entry finally got underway, Komarov grumbled that, quote, "the parachute is wrong and that heat is rising in the capsule." Descending on his 18th orbit, the re-entry orientation was far from perfect. In light of the asymmetrical shape of Soyuz 1 and its inability to effectively execute its attitude control, all of this is just a fancy way of saying that, due to the way the Soyuz craft was designed, it didn't fall as perfectly as it could. It was uncontrollable at some points. Still, the retrofire began at 5:59 AM Moscow time and ran for long enough to ensure that entrance into the upper atmosphere was successful. 13 minutes later, the Yevpatroye control station in Crimea picked up voice communications from the spacecraft, in which Komarov, apparently, advised them of the results of the retrofire and his loss of attitude control. Attitude is a term for the way your craft is orientated to the horizon around you. Communications then fell silent as Soyuz 1, sheathed in a superheated plasma, entered a period of radio blackout. During re-entry, the descent module carrying Komarov should have separated from the remainder of the Soyuz, the orbital module and instrument module, about a dozen minutes after the retrofire. This would have been followed, some 14 minutes later, by the deployment of the parachutes and touchdown in the Soviet Union around 25 minutes after that, so a 25-minute controlled parachute glide down to the surface. Sometime between 6:18 AM and 6:20 AM, Komarov's voice seemed calm and unhurried, in spite of the 8G load imposed by the steep ballistic-style re-entry. Ballistic style means that he's not even controlled, he's just coming in like a bullet, and 8G means that if you weigh 100 kilos, it's going to feel like you weigh 800 kilos. Notwithstanding these problems though, Soyuz 1 might still have landed safely. Then its parachutes failed. Although a drogue chute deployed successfully, the latter failed to pull the main parachute canopy out of its storage canister. Although a reserve parachute was also jettisoned, it became entangled with the cords of the drogue and also failed to open. Soviet anti-aircraft radar had detected the incoming spacecraft at 6:22 AM and predicted its landing a couple of minutes later. Listening posts in Turkey are said to have intercepted Komarov's cries of rage and frustration as he plunged to his death, cursing the engineers and politicians who condemned him to fly in a fault-ridden ship. Whether such words were ever actually spoken, we'll never know. What is known, however, is the sheer chaos that Komarov must have experienced. Travelling at more than 640 kilometers an hour, 400 miles per hour, Soyuz 1 slammed into the ground. Komarov was killed instantly, and the capsule completely flattened. Solid-fueled rockets at its base, meant to fire just before touchdown to cushion the landing, actually detonated on impact, and the remains of the craft burst into flames. Not only had Komarov been killed, but there remained very little of him left. Portable fire extinguishers were useless against the inferno, and the rescuers were forced to shovel clods of earth onto the remains in an attempt to dampen down the flames. The height of the descent module, normally about a 2-metre tall vehicle, had shrunk to a shriveled mess no more than 60 to 70 centimetres tall. That's about 2 foot, I think, 3 foot, whatever. As they continued to fight the fire, the remaining structure collapsed in on itself, leaving nothing but a heap of smouldering wreckage, a couple pools of molten aluminium, and, on top of it all, Soyuz 1's circular entrance hatch. Komarov's remains were, quote, excavated from what was left of his ship. His cause of death would later be attributed to massive multiple injuries to the skull, spinal cord, and bones. Eyewitnesses recounted that the cosmonaut's body had been reduced to a lump 30 centimetres wide by 80 centimetres long. The loss of Soyuz 1 and the death of cosmonaut Colonel Vladimir Komarov was a crushing setback of such magnitude that it directly impacted Russia's last chance to beat America to the moon. But the problems which it uncovered, and which demanded solutions be found before it could fly again, ultimately turned the Soyuz spacecraft into one of the safest and most long-lived vehicles in spaceflight history. So at least that is a fitting memorial to Vladimir Komarov. A pretty good track record from Soyuz 1 until Soyuz 11, with the whole decompression thing and the whole crew dying. And then there was Soyuz 18A. Did I mention Soyuz 18A? Soyuz 18A was intended to be the second mission to take cosmonauts to the Soviet Salyut 4 space station for a 60-day mission. Both cosmonauts on board were on their second mission and had flown their first mission together, Soyuz 12, in September 1973. Their first mission together was to test the new type of Soyuz spacecraft after the fatal accident of Soyuz 11. The launch of Soyuz 18A went according to plan until around T plus 288 seconds. What's T plus 288 seconds mean? So, in movies, you know, when you'll hear T minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff of Space Shuttle Columbia. T minus is when they're counting down to the launch of a shuttle, and T plus is once the shuttle has already launched. So T plus 288 seconds just means we're 288 seconds into the flight. At an altitude of 145 kilometers or 90 miles, the second and third stages of the booster began their separation. Only 3 of the 6 locks holding the stages together, however, released, and the engine ignited with the second stage still attached below it. The third stage's thrust broke the remaining locks, throwing the second stage free, but putting the booster under unexpected strain that caused it to veer off from its proper trajectory. Seconds later, the deviation in the flight path was detected by the Soyuz's onboard guidance system, which activated an automatic abort program. As the launch tower was long gone by this point, the abort process had to be performed with the Soyuz's own engines. This separated the spacecraft from the third stage booster and then separated the orbital and service modules of the Soyuz from the re-entry capsule. At the time when the safety system initiated separation, the spacecraft was already pointed downward towards the Earth. This accelerated its descent even more. Instead of the expected acceleration in such an emergency situation of around 15 Gs, the cosmonauts experienced up to 21.3 Gs. So, going back, if you're 100 kilos, this would feel like you weighed over 2 tons. Despite very high overloading, the capsule's parachutes opened properly and slowed the craft to a successful landing after a flight of only 21 minutes. The capsule landed southwest of Gorno-Altaysk, a point 829 kilometers, 515 miles north of the Chinese border. The capsule landed on a snow-covered slope and began rolling downhill towards a 152-metre, 500-foot sheer drop. The capsule was suddenly snagged on a tree branch, only feet before falling down the cliff face. Amazingly, both cosmonauts survived. Having landed in chest-deep powder snow, and with a local temperature of -7 degrees Celsius, 19 degrees Fahrenheit, the cosmonauts donned their cold weather survival clothing. The cosmonauts were uncertain if they had landed in China, at a time when Sino-Soviet relations were extremely hostile, so they quickly destroyed documents relating to a military experiment planned for the flight. Soon, the crew was in radio contact with a rescue team in an approaching helicopter, who confirmed they were in the Soviet Union, near the town of Alyesk. The deep snow, the high altitude, and the terrain meant the rescuers had great difficulty in making contact with the cosmonauts. It wasn't until the next day before they were safely airlifted out. The official reports vary pretty widely in how many people have actually died in space. Officially, it's only the crew of Soyuz 11, as those 3 cosmonauts were over 100 kilometers above the surface of the Earth when they died, so they officially died in space, but there's a lot of people that died in the lead-up and in the research and the test pilots and things of that nature. There's actually a small statue placed on the moon in memory of all those that have died in the quest to get us to boldly go where no one's ever gone before, as Star Trek put it. Prior to his Apollo 15 lunar mission, astronaut David Scott met Belgian painter and printmaker Paul van Hooydonk at a dinner party. Van Hooydonk agreed that he would create a small statuette for the astronaut David Scott to place on the moon during the Apollo 15 mission. Near the completion of his work on the lunar surface on the 1st of August 1971, Scott secretly placed the statue titled Fallen Astronaut on the moon, along with a plaque bearing the names of 8 American astronauts and 6 Soviet cosmonauts who had died in service. Theodore C. Freeman died October 31st, 1964, in an aircraft accident. Charles A. Bassett II died February 28, 1966, also in an aircraft accident. Elliot M. C. Jr. also died in an aircraft accident on February 28, 1966. Virgil I. Grissom died January 27, 1967, along with his crewmates Roger B. Chaffee, Edward H. White II, in the Apollo fire. Vladimir M. Komarov died on April 24, 1967, as we know, after his parachute failed and he slammed into the Earth aboard Soyuz 1. Edward G. Givens Jr. died June 6, 1967, in an automobile accident. Clifton C. Williams Jr. died October 5, 1967, in an aircraft training accident. The Russian national treasure, Yuri A. Gagarin, died March 27, 1968, in a test aircraft accident. Pavel I. Belyaev died January 10, 1970, from illness. Georgy T. Brovlovsky died June 30th, 1971, along with his crew members Viktor I. Patsayev and Vladislav N. Kolkov, all during the re-entry pressurization failure on board Soyuz 11. Scott photographed the memorial, but waited for a post-mission press conference to publicly disclose its existence. Later he noted that, quote, "Sadly, 2 names are missing from the plaque, those of Valentin Bodorenko and Grigory Nelyubov." He explained that the Western world was unaware of their deaths because of the secrecy surrounding the Soviet space program at the time. Also missing was the name of Robert Henry Lawrence Jr., the first black astronaut and a United States aircraft officer selected for the manned orbiting laboratory program. He was killed in a training accident in 1967, but left off for no other reason than it appears just straight up racism. As JFK put it in his awesome speech, we choose to go to the moon and do the other things, not because they're easy, but because they're hard.
When I was young, I told my mom to walk on the moon someday. Armstrong and Aldrin spoke to me. Houston and Cape Kennedy, and to watch the Eagle landing on a night when the moon was full. And as it tugged at the tides, I knew that deep inside I too could feel its pull. I lie in my bed and dreamed I walked the sea of tranquility. I knew that someday soon we'd all sail to the moon. On the high tide of technology, the dreams had all been taken, and the window seats taken too. And 2001 is almost come and gone. What am I supposed to do now that the space race is over? It's been and it's gone, and I'll never get to the moon. Now that the space race is over, and I can't help but feel we've all grown up too soon. Now my dreams have all been shattered, and my wings are tattered too. And I can still fly, but not half as high as once I wanted to. Now that the space race is over, it's been and it's gone, and I'll never get to the moon. Now that the space race is over, and I can't help but feel we've all grown up too soon. My son and I stand beneath the great night sky, gaze up in wonder, tell him the tale of Apollo. And he says, why did they ever go? It may look like some empty gesture to go all that way just to come back, but don't offer me a place out in cyberspace, 'cause where